What is the goal of game design? This is perhaps the most important question a designer can ask themselves, because all designers should strive to make the best game that they possibly can make. Understanding what good design is can help designers diagnose problems with their games and to provide a goal that they can constantly work towards. Before getting into today's topic, I just want to remind everyone that this is only one lens which can be used to analyze a game's design. While I personally find this concept to be extremely useful across many kinds of games, I will not definitively say that this concept is objectively the best way to design and analyze a game. Just keep that small disclaimer in mind as I move on with the video. There are many answers to the question I posed at the start of the video, but my personal favorite answer was proposed by Eric Zimmerman and Katie Salen in The Rules of Play. According to Zimmerman and Salen, the goal of game design is to create meaningful play. But what is meaningful play? At a basic level, meaningful play describes the relationship between a player's action and the way a game system responds to that action. The meaning of a game's mechanics can be found in this relationship, and any meaningful game will ensure that the relationship is loaded with as much meaning as possible. As an example, consider a game of chess. When I choose to move my rook to the back row and checkmate my opponent's king, what makes that action meaningful? This action isn't meaningful because I decided to move my rook to the back row. This action was meaningful because I decided to move my rook to the back row, and now my opponent's king is unable to escape and I win the game. That is meaningful play. My action involved me moving my rook, and the system responded to that action by declaring me the winner. There was an action followed by a meaningful response to that action. Meaningful play is important because without it, play feels pointless, and it is hard to speak to a player through an experience of play if that play itself is meaningless. As designers, we should aim to design games that enrich our players' lives, and that is impossible to do without meaningful play. Not all play is created equal. Some games are able to create engaging experiences for the player, while others leave the player thinking that their time has been wasted. The first category provides meaningful play, and the second category does not. So how can a designer tell the difference between meaningful play and non-meaningful play? There are two requirements that play needs before it can be considered meaningful. The first of these is discernibility. Discernibility is the ability for the player to know that their actions are having an effect on the game system. Each game will inform the player in slightly different ways, and there's no best way to communicate the effects of action onto the player. Sometimes pieces on a board change positions, and thus the meaning of the game changes. Sometimes the game plays a special animation. Sometimes there's a sound effect. As long as a game element helps the player feel like their action is accomplishing something, it is building discernibility. Without discernibility, players will not have any direction, since they have no idea that their actions are having any effect on the game state. And if the player cannot tell what their actions are accomplishing, they will lose interest very quickly. While discernibility is present to some extent in every game, there are techniques that a game can employ to increase discernibility of a player's actions. Feedback that engages multiple senses will be much more likely to get the player's attention, as will designing a clear and consistent UI. Of course, all of the discernibility in the world will not help a game at all if it doesn't have anything to inform the player of. This is where our second requirement comes in. To create meaningful play, a game needs integration. Integration is present when the outcome of a player's action affects the rest of the game. Games are defined by their interactive nature. and integration is all about making the player's interaction feel important. If the player's action doesn't alter the game state in a meaningful way, the player will feel that their action is pointless, and when that happens, players rarely stick around for long. In a meaningful game, every element is tied together, working to improve the game as a whole. These responses can take many forms. Some actions might result in mechanical changes to the game state. Perhaps an action revealed an unseen enemy, which changes the player's strategic understanding of the game state. Other games might respond by changing the narrative landscape, by implementing new dialogue or cutscenes. In this case, taking certain actions might progress the story, or present the player with new narrative information. Some games can respond in both ways simultaneously, by allowing the mechanical and narrative states of the game to interact with each other. It is important to note that integration is not the same thing as giving the player a lot of choice, or even providing the player with a large possibility space. Integration is only concerned with making the player feel like their actions matter, and having a large amount of choices doesn't necessarily translate into a high amount of integration. For instance, consider the beginner's guide. In this game, players are forced to play through a series of linear levels with no ability to alter the story and with very little room to interact mechanically with the game world. However, this game still creates meaningful play. When the player takes certain actions, usually walking forward, the system responds by giving the player new narrative information. Let's take a moment to look at a game that fails to create meaningful integration: Monopoly. On a player's turn, they need to throw the dice and move their piece. If the player is lucky, they might get to buy a property. Players don't have the ability to strategically grab useful properties because they aren't in control of their own movement. And even after a player buys a property, other players might not land on that property for long periods of time, making that choice feel insignificant in the long run. This system does not create meaningful play because the game doesn't significantly respond to the player's actions. All the player does is roll a dice, and maybe they lose a small percentage of their money. This new game state doesn't change the player's strategy at all, and on their next turn, the player will roll their dice and do the exact same thing that they did on their previous turn. Compare this to a game like Armello. Even though Armello has a lot of random elements, it can generate meaningful play because the system responds to the player and allows them to change their strategy over the course of the game. For instance, let's say that a player chooses to attack another player but fails to damage them. Going forward, the player will need to change their strategy to account for this fact. Actions lead into responses, which changes the player's understanding of the gameplay, which leads into future actions. That is ultimately why Armello can generate meaningful play and Monopoly can't. These two elements, discernibility and integration, work together to give meaning to the player's action in different ways. Discernibility is all about acknowledging the player's action, while integration is all about making the player's actions feel important. One element cannot exist without the other, and they are in a mutual relationship. Being able to discern the effects of an action will go a long way towards making the player feel like their actions are meaningful. At the same time, an integrated action is pointless if the player cannot discern that the changes to the system came about through their actions. Ultimately, meaningful play is about forcing the player to reconsider both the mechanical and narrative landscapes of a game throughout the course of play. To show how important meaningful play is, think of your favorite game. Some of you might be picturing a story-heavy RPG. Some of you might be picturing a competitive first-person shooter. Some of you might be picturing an intense roguelike. And some of you might be picturing something else entirely. Despite this huge amount of variation, I can almost guarantee that your favorite game has meaningful play. It is a concept which transcends genre and specific mechanics, but that transcendence is precisely why it is so important. Play is not just a survival tool we use to sharpen our skills in preparation of hardship. Play can be inherently meaningful on its own terms. It doesn't need some practical reason to exist, because taken on its own, play allows us to explore the meaning of the world around us and how we fit into that world. We play because it is enjoyable, and we find inherent value in the act of play. Meaningful play is an element vital to every single great game I have ever talked about, and ever will talk about, which is why I have made this video explaining the concept. I've had to dance around this a couple of times in previous videos, but now that I have defined what meaningful play is, I can build off of this concept in future videos to show how certain games can deliver or fail to deliver meaningful play. If you want to be notified of those future videos, feel free to subscribe to be notified of my future uploads. And if you already are subscribed, consider sharing this video with someone else, since that is the most reliable way you can spread this video. And with that, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.